Good morning, everyone. We are the Group 3, and our report is all about summary on ethical teachings. So, our first reporter is Mr. Karaan Jericho Angelo.
Good day, everyone. I'm Jericho Angelo Digaran. I will present to you the Aristotle ethical teachings. First, the Aristotelian ethics. Aristotle first used the term ethics to name a field of study developed by his ancestors, Socrates and Plato. In philosophy, ethics is the attempt to offer a rational response to the question of how humans should best live. Aristotle regarded ethics and politics as two related but separate fields of study. Since ethics examines the good of the individual, while politics examines the good of the city-state, which he considered to be the best type of community. So the Aristotle emphasized that virtue is practical and that purpose of ethics is to become good. So ano nga ba yung virtue na sinasabi? Virtue is Latin virtus is moral excellence. A virtue is a trait or quality that is deemed to be morally good and thus valued as a foundation. So Aristotle also claims that the right course of action depends upon the details of a particular situation rather than being generated merely by applying a law. The type of wisdom which is required for this is called prudence or practical wisdom. So as opposed to be the wisdom of theoretical philosopher, Greek Sophia. But despite the importance of practical decision making, the final analysis, the original Aristotelian and Socratic answer to the question of how best to live, at least for the best type of human, was, if possible, to live the life of philosophy. The next is Aristotle as a Socratic. Aristotle's ethics builds upon earlier Greek thought, particularly that of his teacher Plato, and Plato's teacher is Socrates. While Socrates left no written works and Plato wrote dialogues and few letters, Aristotle wrote treatises in which he sets forth philosophical doctrines directly. For the practical ethics, Aristotle believed that ethical knowledge is not only a theoretical knowledge, but rather than a person must have experience of the action in life and have been brought up in fine habits to become good. For a person to become virtuous, he can simply study what is virtue, but must actually to do is the virtuous thing. Yun yung sinasabi nating moral excellence. Ito yung quality na meron yung isang tao. The next one is the Aristotle starting point. The Aristotelian ethics all aim to begin with approximate but uncontroversial starting points. In the Nicomachean ethics, Aristotle says explicitly that one must begin with what is familiar to us and that. The next is the moral virtue. A moral virtue or excellence of character is the disposition to act excellently, which a person develops partly as a result of upbringing and partly as a result of his habit of action. Aristotle developed his analysis of character in book of the Nicomachean Ethics. So, where he makes his argument that the character arises from habit, likening ethical character to a skill that is acquired through practice, such as learning of musical instrument. In Book 3 of Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argues that a person's character is voluntary since it results from many individual actions which is under voluntary control. So, personal virtues are characteristics valued as promoting collective and individual greatness. In other words, it is behavior that shows high moral standards, doing what is right and avoiding what is wrong. The opposite of virtue is vice. Another example of this is merit in Asian tradition. For the Nicomachean Ethics, it is the name normally given to Aristotle's best known work on ethics. The work which plays a preeminent role in defining Aristotelian ethics consists of 10 books originally, separate scrolls, and is understood to be based on notes from his lectures at the Lyceum. The next one is the four cardinal virtues, the prudence, also known as practice, temperance or self-control simply means moderation. Soldier must display moderation with their environment while at war, in the midst of violence activities. All wisdom is the most important virtue for Aristotle. Courage is the moderation or observance of the mean with respect to feelings or fear and confidence. The next one is the justice, means giving the enemy what is due to them in the proper way of being just toward them.
St. Thomas Aquinas Ethics. Aquinas believes that happiness is not equated with pleasure, material possessions, honor, or any sensual good. So, pinapaliwanag po ni Aquinas na ang kasiyahan ay hindi lamang makikita sa materialis na bagay, sa pansariling kasiyahan, sa mga awards na natatanggap sa kahit anumang parangal. Samantala, on the second paragraph, sinasabi niya na ang happiness is only found in the souls of the blessed in heaven. So, in short po, sa madaling salita na ay matatagpuan po natin ang tunay na kasiyahan sa langit. Ito po ay walang hanggang kasiyahan. Kaya, yung kasiyahan po na natatanggap natin ngayon is hindi pa po yung sapat sapagkat ang tunay na kasiyahan po ay nasa langit lamang. Types of laws. According to Aquinas, there are 4 types of law, which is eternal law, natural law, human law, and divine law. Firstly is the eternal law. This refers to the rational plan of God by which all creation is ordered. The best that I can describe in this eternal law is lahat ay totoo. Kumbaga po ay lahat na nangyayari, lahat ng narito, lahat ng meron tayo is totoo. For example, God is totoo. God is eternal, God is forever. And isa pa is yung mundo. Ito ay totoo at alam naman natin na totoo ito. Kaya masasabi na eternal law is somehow describes everything is true. Natural law is that aspect of the eternal law which is accessible to human reason. Ito yung aspeto na batas na walang katapusan at dito papasok yung moral law. Ito yung nag-o-order ito yung law na mag-uugnay sa tao na gumawa ng mabuti sa halip na gumawa ng masama. Ito yung law na nagpapaayos sa katauhan. Ito ay ginawa ng Diyos upang maging maayos ang takbo ng mundo, ang takbo ng mga tao. Human law. Human law is supposed to spell out what natural law prescribes. So, ang human law is ito yung related sa natural law na kung saan dito papasok yung mga batas ng tao tulad ng criminal laws, mga pagnanakaw, maraming mga criminal dito sa lupa, ganun. Tapos ang law na ito, ang gumawa ng law na ito is ang tayo mismo. At merong mga batas na hindi sang-ayon sa mga tao. At itong mga batas na ito ay tulad ng mga shoot to kill orders, mga batas na patungkol sa drug, tapos ay drug na basta na lang papatayin, tapos ay itong batas na ito ay hindi totoo, hindi tunay na batas ng human law, at ito ay hindi obligadong gawin ng mga tao, at hindi obligadong sundin ng mga tao. Divine law serves to complement the other types of law. It is a law of revelation. So, dito naman po sa divine law na ito yung uukma sa iba pang mga uri ng batas. At ito po ay law na magmula sa scriptures, kumbaga ay Holy Bible. At ang batas na ito po ay ang sinusunod natin sa mga pamamagitan ng Biblia. Dito po mapasok yung 10 Commandments. Yung ganun po. Tapos ay dito natin malalaman ang ating salvation, kung kailan matatapos ang lahat, kung ano ang mangyayari. Features of human actions. Binanggit ni Aquinas na mayroong 3 human actions. Ito ay ang species, accidents, and ends. The species of an action refers to its kind. It is also called the object of an action. So, binanggit ni Aquinas na ang ibig sabihin pala ng Aquinas na ang species ay nahahati sa dalawa. Ito ay ang maaaring mabuti at masama. So, ang tao meron silang dalawang species. Ito ay ang mabuti at ito ay masama. Ito ay sa pamamagitan ng pagpapaliwanag ni Aquinas tungkol sa species. Sa accidents naman, accidents refer to the circumstance surrounding of an action. So, accidents, siyempre, nakasurround to sa atin. So, anytime, pwede ito mangyari. Anytime, i-encounter natin ito. So, pinaliwanag ni Aquinas na ito ay kabilang sa natural law na kaya nagkaka-aksidente rin, hindi rin tayo nasunod sa mga dapat sunding batas tulad ng sa human law. Ito kasi na sa human law, for example ay mayroong traffic signs na hindi mo sinunod, overspeeding ka, so maaari kang mapunta sa accidents kasi hindi mo sinunod yung human law na binanggit. So, end stands for the agent's intention. An act might be unjust through its intention. To intend to direct oneself against a good is clearly immoral. Aquinas gives murder, lying, and blasphemy as instantiation of this ill will. Correspondingly, a bad intention can spoil a good act. So, kahit sakaling gumawa ka ng mabuti, maaring yung ginawa mong mabuti is makakasama sa ibang tao or makakasama sa iyo. Pwede ring gumagawa ka ng mabuti para lang masabing ikaw ay mabuti. Or pwedeng ring nagnanakaw ka para lang makatulong sa iba. Para kay Aquinas, ito ay sobrang sama at ito ay immoral at ito ay unjust act, so napakasamang gawain nga po nito. The virtues. Aquinas agrees with Aristotle that the particulars of the situation have to be considered in determining what course of action should be done. To act well in each situation, one, however, will always need the so-called virtues. These virtues serve as personal guidelines, equipping us to achieve practical ends. So, kailangan natin ng virtues upang mapapunta tayo sa final end na kung saan natin gusto pumunta. Aquinas defines virtue as a good habit bearing on activity or a good faculty habit. Ito ay sinasabi ni Aquinas na magandang gawain. At ito ay napapasok sa habit. So habits are firm disposition are hard to eradicate. Qualities that dispose us to act in a particular manner. So ang habits, ito yung habit na palagi natin ginagawa. Kumbaga ay nakasanayan, ganun. From the word habit. So, ang habits is Aquinas differentiates habit into two parts. Ito ay acquired tsaka infused. So, ang acquired habit is the autonomous will of a person plays a major role in acquired habits as they involve consistent deliberate effort to do an act time and again and despite obstructions. So, ito yung acquired habits na paulit-ulit mong ginagawa. Kumbaga, for example is paliligo mo sa trabaho. So, kailangan mo siyang ulitin kasi kailangan at kahit anong obstruction ay gagawin mo to kasi nakasanayan mo na at sadya mong ginagawa. The infused habits. The infused virtues on the other hand are independent of this process as they are directly instilled by God in our faculties. These virtues are thus divine gifts which elevate the activities of those who receive them. So, isang example na infused habits is yung pag nagdadasal ka tapos ay nasasagot yung hiling mo. So, at dahil nasasagot yung hiling mo, may tendency na gusto mo siyang ulitin hanggang sa umaabot na maging habit mo na. Next one is Aquinas mentioned at least two kinds of infused virtues. These are the moral and theological. So, sa moral virtues naman, have as their object not God Himself, but activities that are less virtuous and inferior to the final end. To this kind belong the four basic virtues: prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice. So, sa una sa prudence. Ang prudence ay nagsasabi na ito ay consciousness. So, pagiging mababa ang loob mo, kumbaga ay simpleng bagay, pasalamatan mo, at ito'y maaaring magligtas sa'yo to the final end. So, pag may ginawa kang mali, humingi ka ng kapatawaran, gano'n. Tapos sa fortitude naman is ang hindi ka gagawa ng masama para maging success ka lang. Kumbaga, for example, is wala kang aapakan tao para maging successful ka lang at para umangat sa buhay. Then sa temperance is yung for example, nagiinom ka tapos ay siyempre pag nagiinom tayo, hindi naman natin nasasabi kung ano natin ginagawa tuwing tayo nagiinom. So ito yung magpapaiwas sa atin ng moral virtues. Kumbaga ay sa moral na para gumawa ng tama. So, sa justice naman is yung justisya na sa justice naman is siyempre ang masasabi ko lang sa justice is pagrespeto sa isang tao. Kumbaga yun, alam nga natin ng justice. So, alam naman natin lahat ng justice is yung paghingi ng justisya kung sakaling may kaso yung isang tao na kailangan natin ng justisya. So, respect din sa tao. Ganun. So, sa theological virtues, on the other hand, are concerned directly with God. They provide us with true knowledge and desire of God and of His will, faith, hope, and love serve to attune us to our final end, which God Himself, faith, makes us recognize and believe in the true God. So, ang theological virtues naman ang magsasabi sa atin, ito yung nagsasabi sa atin na there is only one God and isa lang gustong parating ng theological virtues. Ito yung ang paniniwala sa totoong Diyos, kumbaga. At ito yung hiling natin upang at ito yung hiling natin na gusto nating mapapunta sa Kanya at sa piling Niya. At ang pagmamahal ang magiging sagot ang magiging sagot upang respetohin natin ang Diyos. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Glenn M. Borciliano, a member of Group 3, and I'm going to report the topic Immanuel Kant's Ethical Teachings. Immanuel Kant's Ethical Teachings. At the foundation of Kant's system is the doctrine of transcendental idealism, which emphasizes a distinction between what we can experience and what we cannot. According sa transcendental idealism ni Immanuel Kant, dito ay ine-emphasize or pinapakita yung pagkakaiba ng what we can experience at from what we cannot. Yung mga what we can experience are like the natural objects or everything you can see around the world. And those we cannot is the super sensible or yung tinatawag nating the soul and the God. Kant's ethics are organized around the notion of a categorical imperative, which is a universal ethical principle stating that one should always respect the humanity in others, and that one should only act in accordance with the rules that could hold for everyone. Yung categorical imperative ni Kant ay nagsasabi na lahat ng tao ay dapat irespeto ang isa't isa or yung pagkatao ng bawat isa at dapat kikilos lamang na sumusunod sa mga rules na nangangalaga sa isa't isa. Kant also argued that his ethical theory requires belief in free will, God, and the immortality of the soul. Metaphysics and epistemology. The most important element of Kant's mature metaphysics and epistemology is his doctrine of transcendental idealism, which received its fullest discussion in Critique of Pure Reason from 1781 to 1787. Dito ay pinag-usapan yung metaphysics and epistemology na nakapaloob sa transcendental idealism, at ito ay pinag-usapan noong 1781 hanggang 1787 sa Critique of Pure Reason ni Kant. Pre-critical thought. Kant's first purely philosophical work was the new elucidation of the first principle of metaphysical cognition noong 1755. Dogmatic slumber, synthetic a priori knowledge, and the Copernican shift. Although the early Kant showed a complete willingness to dissent from many important aspects of Wolffian orthodoxy of the time, Kant continued to take for granted the basic rationalist assumption that metaphysical cognition was possible. Dito ay pinag-uusapan or pinapakita yung kung paano naapektuhan ni David Hume si Kant tungkol sa knowledge between the cause and effect of a thing. Sinabi ni David Hume na ang kaalaman ay natututunan natin mula sa cause and effect sa pamamagitan ng ating mga senses. At dito ay napagtanto ni Kant na totoo pala si Hume na lahat ng kaalaman na ating natututunan ay mula sa cause and effect sa pamamagitan ng ating mga senses. Sa madaling salita, lahat ng bagay na ating nakikita, nararanasan ay siyang kaalaman. So, knowledge is derived from cause and effect through our senses or through what we can experience. For example, is the question, why mathematical truths necessarily hold true in the natural world? Bakit kailangan ng mga scientifical at mathematical na kaalaman upang mapag-aralan ang natural world? The cognitive faculties and their representation. Kant's theory of the mind is organized around an account of mind's powers, its cognitive faculties. Dito ay sinasabi ni Kant na ang ating isip ay may dalawang trabaho. Ang una ay ang sensibility. Ang sensibility ay, ang trabaho nito ay malaman ang isang bagay sa pamamagitan ng ating mga senses o yung ating pandama. At ang pangalawa naman ay understanding. Ito naman, ang trabaho nito ay ang isipin kung ano yung isang bagay na nalaman natin sa pamamagitan ng ating mga pandama. So, ibig sabihin, ang ating isip ay nagpa-process or nag-iisip una sa pamamagitan ng sensibility, and followed by understanding. Transcendental idealism. Transcendental idealism is a theory about relation between the mind and its object. Dito, tinatalakay ang things as they appear and things as they are in themselves. Sa madaling salita, dito ay sinasabi na ang transcendental idealism ay kung anong bagay sila at kung anong itsura meron sila sa panlabas. The ideality of space and time. Kant argues that space and time are priori subjective condition on the possibility of experience, that is, that they are transcendentally ideal. Dito sinasabi na ang isang bagay ay mayroong espasyo at oras sa kung paano sila nakikita or kung ano yung kanilang hitsura. Sa pangkalahatan, nalalaman natin ang mga bagay-bagay sa pamamagitan ng kanilang hitsura na ating nakikita or nararanasan as we encounter them. Appearance and things in themselves. According to two-word interpretation, the distinction between appearance and things in themselves is to be understood in metaphysical and ontological terms. Una, ang appearance ay kung ano yung bagay physically or anong hitsura niya sa pangkalahatan na ating nararanasan. At ang pangalawa ay things in themselves are ontologically or yung mga bagay na ating nalalaman or kung anong uri ng bagay sila. Minsan, ang things in themselves ay ating nararanasan mula sa kanilang hitsura. Pero hindi lahat ng hitsura na ating nararanasan ay considered as things in themselves. The deduction of the categories. Kant's argument in the deduction is a transcendental argument. Theory of experience. The principles of the analogies of experience are important metaphysical principles, and if Kant's arguments for them are successful, they mark significant advance in the metaphysical investigation of nature. The first analogy is a form of principle of the conservation of matter. It shows that matter can never be created or annihilated by natural means. It can only be altered. The second analogy is a version of the principle of sufficient reason applied to experience. Causes being sufficient reasons for their effects. And lastly, the third analogy to establish a transcendental, a priori basis for something like Newton's law of universal gravitation, which says that no matter how far apart two objects are, they will exert some degree of gravitational influence on each other. Critique of transcendent metaphysics. One of the most important upshots of Kant's theory of experience is that it is possible to have knowledge of the world, because the world as we experience it conforms to the condition and the possibility of experience. Dito sinasabi na lahat ng bagay sa mundo ay may nakapaloob na kaalaman dahil sila ay ating nakikita at ating nararanasan. Tinawag ito ni Kant na ideas dahil ang ideas ay kaalaman na nakapaloob sa lahat ng bagay dito sa mundo na ating nakikita. At lahat ng ating nakikita ito ay ating nararanasan kung kaya't nalalaman natin ang kanilang ideas. The soul, paralogism of pure reason. Kant addressed the metaphysics of the soul, an inquiry he refers to as rational psychology. Marami ang nagsasabi na ang salitang I mula sa salitang I think ay isang substance or isang object na nangangahulugan na soul. At ito ay hindi pinatotohanan ni Kant dahil sinasabi niya na ito ay isa lamang transcendental illusion, na kung saan ang transcendental illusion is a rational psychology arises when the mere thought of the I in the preposition I think is a mistaken for the cognition of I as an object. A cognition involves both intuition and concept, while a mere thought involves only concept. The word antinomies of pure reason. The antinomies of pure reason deal with rational cosmology, that is, with metaphysical inquiry into the nature of the cosmos considered as totality. Ang antinomy is a conflict of reason. Antinomies ay umuusbong kapag ang pangangatwiran ay nagpapatunay sa dalawang magkasalungat na bagay, nagpapakay ka ng hindi pagkasigurado. God, ideal of pure reason. The ideal of pure reason addresses the idea of God and argues that it is impossible to provoke the existence of God. Sinasabi ni Kant na ang ideal of pure reason ay kanyang idea of God. At sinasabi niya na imposibleng mapatunayan ang existence of God. Si Kant ay kilala sa kanyang mga paniniwala na lahat ng bagay na ating nakikita at nararanasan ay mayroong kaalaman. Ngunit, sinabi ni Kant na ang idea of God is the most real being. This most real being is also considered by reason to be a necessary being. That is something which exists necessarily instead of merely contingently. Kant argues that there are only three possible arguments for the existence of such being, and that none is successful. Thus, Kant identifies that the idea of God is the most real being. Philosophy of mathematics. Recall that an analytical judgment is one where the truth of the judgment depends only on the relation between the concepts used in the judgment. The truth of synthetic judgment, by contrast, requires that an object be given in sensibility and that the concepts used in judgment be combined in the object. It may seem surprising that one's knowledge of mathematical truths depends on an object being given in a sensibility, for we surely don't arrive at mathematical judgment by empirical means.
Natural science. Kant displayed an active interest in the natural science throughout his career. Karamihan sa kanyang mahalagang kontribusyon ay nasa physical science, hindi lamang ang physics proper kundi pati na rin sa earth science at cosmology. Sa Critique of the Power of Judgment, nagbigay rin siya ng mahabang talakayan tungkol sa philosophical basis sa pag-aaral ng biological entity. In general, Kant thought that a body of knowledge could only count as a science in the true sense if it could admit of mathematical description and an a priori principle that could be presented a priori intuition. Hence, Kant was pessimistic about the possibility of empirical psychology ever amounting to a true science. Kant even thought it might be the case that chemistry can be nothing more than a systematic art or experimental doctrine, but never a proper science. Kant's interest in physical theory began early. His first published work ay tungkol sa true estimation of living forces. Was inquiry into some foundational problems in physics, and it entered into a viva, living forces. Debate sa pagitan ni Leibniz at ng Cartesians regarding how to quantify force in moving objects. For the most part, ang pabor ni Kant ay sa mga Leibnizians. A few years later, sinulat ni Kant ang physical monadology, which dealt with other foundational questions in physics. Kant's mature physical theory is presented in its fullest form in Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science. The continuity with the theory of experience from the Critique is implicit in the very structure of the Metaphysical Foundations. just as Kant's theory of experience was divided into four sections corresponding to the four groups of categories: quantity, quality, relation, modality. The body of the metaphysical foundation is also divided along the same lines. Other scientific contributions. In addition to his major contributions to physics, Kant published various writings addressing different issues in the natural science. Early on, he showed a great deal of interest in geology and earth science. Binaturan ito ang ilan sa mga title ng kanyang mga naisulat. The Question, Whether the Earth is Aging, Considered from a Physical Point of View, On the Causes of Earthquakes on the Occasion of the Calamity that befell the western countries of Europe towards the end of the last year, Continued Observations on the Earthquakes that have been experienced for some time, New Notes to explain the theory of winds, in which at the same time he invites attendance to his lectures. One of Kant's most lasting scientific contributions came from his early work in cosmology. In his Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens, Kant gave a mechanical explanation of the formation of the solar system and the galaxies in terms of the principle of Newton's physics. A shorter version of the argument also appears in The Only Possible Argument in support of a demonstration of the existence of God. Kant's hypothesis was that a single mechanical process could explain why we observe an orbital motion of smaller bodies around larger ones at many different scales in the cosmos. Moon around planets, planet around stars, and stars around the center of the galaxy. Moral theory. Kant's moral theory is organized around the idea that to act morally and to act in accordance with reason are one and the same. In virtue of being a rational agent, that is, in virtue of possessing practical reason in which is interested and goal-directed, one is obligated to follow the moral law that practical reasons prescribe. To do otherwise is to act irrationally, because Kant placed his emphasis on the duty that comes with being a rational agent who is cognizant of the moral law. Kant's theory is considered a form of deontology, na nanggaling sa salitang Griego na deon means duty or obligation. The goodwill and duty. Kant argued that there is only one thing that can be considered unconditionally good, a good will. A person has a good will insofar as they form their intentions on the basis of self-conscious respect for the moral law. That is, for the rules regarding what is rational agent thought to do, one's duty. The value of a good will lies in the principles on the basis of which it forms its intentions. It does not lie in the consequences of the actions that the intentions leads to. This is true even if a good will never leads to any desirable consequences at all. Even if this will should wholly lack the capacity to carry out his purpose, then like a jewel, it would still shine by itself as something that has its full worth in itself. The categorical imperative. If a good will is one that forms its intention on the basis of correct principles of action, then we want to know what sort of principles these are. A principle that commands an action is called an imperative. Most imperatives are hypothetical imperatives. That is, they are commands that hold only if certain conditions are met. The point of Kant's appeal to the universal law formulation of the categorical imperative is to show that an action is morally permissible only if the maxim on which the action is based could be affirmed as a universal law that everyone obey without exception. The mark of immortality then is that one makes an exception for oneself. That is one act in a way that they would not want everyone else to. When someone chooses to lie about an adulterous liaison, one is implicitly thinking, in general, people should tell the truth, but in this case, I will be the exception to the rule. Postulates of practical reason. Kant's argument for immortality and God as postulates of practical reason presuppose that the reality of the moral law and the freedom of the will have been established, and they also depend on the principle that ought implies can. One cannot be obligated to do something unless the thing is question is doable. For instance, there is no sense in which I am obligated to single-handedly solve global poverty because it is not within my power to do so. According to Kant, the ultimate aim of a rational moral agent should be to become perfectly moral. We are obligated to strive to become ever more moral, given the of implies can principle. If we ought to work towards moral perfection, then moral perfection must be possible and we can become perfect. However, Kant holds the moral perfection is something that finite rational agents such as humans can only progress towards, but not actually attain in any infinite amount of time, and certainly not within any one human lifetime. In short, one's belief that one should strive towards moral perfection presupposes the belief in the moral of the soul. Political theory and theory of human history. Kant's ethical theory is emphasize reason, autonomy, and a respect for the humanity of others. These central aspects of his theory of individual moral choice are carried over to his theories of humanity's history and of ideal political organizations. Human history and the Age of Enlightenment. Kant's socio-political philosophy must be understood in terms of his understanding of the history of humanity, of its teleology, and in terms of his particular time and place, Europe during the Enlightenment. The goal of humanity is to reach a point where all interpersonal interactions are conducted in accordance with reason and hence in accordance with the moral law. Kant thinks that there are two significant conditions that must be in place before such an enlightened age can come to be. First, human must live in a perfectly just society under a perfectly just constitution. Second, the nations of the world must coexist as an international federation in a state of perpetual peace. Kant's fullest articulation of his political theory appears in the Doctrine of Right, which is the first half of Metaphysics of Morals. In line with his beliefs that a freedom grounded in rationality is what bestows dignity upon human beings, Kant organized his theory of justice around the notion of freedom. Any action is right if it can coexist with everyone's freedom in accordance with the universal law, or if on its mixing freedom of choice of each can coexist with everyone's freedom in accordance with a universal law. Perpetual peace. Kant elaborates the cosmopolitan theory first proposed in Idea for the Universal History in his Towards Perpetual Peace. The basic idea is that world peace can be achieved only when international relations mirror, in certain respects, the relations between individuals in a just society. In general, just as individuals, we need to arrange themselves into just societies. States considered as individual themselves must arrange themselves into a global federation, a league of nations. According to Kant, war is result of an imbalance or disequilibrium in international relations. Although wars are never desirable, they lead to new conditions in international relations, and sometimes these new conditions are more balanced than the previous ones. Theory of art and beauty. Kant's most worked-out presentation of his views on aesthetic appears in Critique of the Power of Judgment, also known as the Third Critique. As the title implies, Kant's aesthetic theory is cashed out through an analysis of the operations of the faculty of judgment. That is, Kant explains what it is for something to be beautiful by explaining what goes into the judgment that something is beautiful, the beautiful and the sublime. Kant holds that there are three different types of aesthetic judgment: judgment of the agreeable, of the beautiful, and of the sublime. The first is not particularly interesting because it pertains simply to whatever objects happen to cause us, personally, pleasure or pain. There is nothing universal about such as judgment. If one person finds botanical gin pleasant and another does not, there is no disagreement, simply different response to the stimulus. Judgment of the beautiful and the sublime, however, are more interesting and worth spending some time on. Theory of art. Both natural objects and man-made art can be judged to be beautiful. Kant suggests that natural beauties are purest, but works of art are especially interesting because they result from human genius. Although art must be man-made and not natural, Kant holds that art is beautiful insofar as it imitates the beauty of nature. Kant divides the art into three groups: the art of speech, rhetoric, and the poetry, pictorial arts, sculpture and architecture and painting, and the art of play or sensations, music, and the art of colors. These can, of course, be combined together. For instance, opera combines music and poetry into song and combines this with theater, which Kant considers a form of painting. Kant deems poetry the greatest of the arts because of its ability to stimulate the imagination and understanding and expand the mind through reflection. Music is the most successful if judged in terms of charm and movement of the mind, because it evokes the effects and feeling of human speech, but without being constrained by the determinate concept of actual words. Relation to moral theory. A final important aspect of Kant's aesthetic theory is his claims that beauty is a symbol of morality, and aesthetic judgment thereby functions as a sort of propedeutic for moral cognition. This is because certain aspects of judgments of taste are analogous in important respect to moral judgments. The immediacy and disinterestedness of aesthetic appreciation correspond to the demand that moral virtue be praised even when it does not lead to tangibly beneficial consequences. It is good in itself. The free play of the faculties involved in appreciation of the beautiful remains one of the freedom necessary for and presupposed by morality, and the universality and necessity involved in aesthetic judgment correspond to the universality and necessity of the moral law. Anthropology, for Kant, is simply the study of human nature. Pragmatic anthropology is useful, practical knowledge that students would need in order to successfully navigate the world and get through life.
Hi, I'm Giovanna Alfonso G. Garcia from DET 2201. In this video, I will discuss with you the summarized ethical teaching of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that determines right from wrong by focusing on the outcomes. It is a form of consequentialism. It is the most common approach in business, which accounts causes and benefits. The example of utilitarianism is choosing between the most pleasurable or the normal level. In my experience, before choosing the course that I will choose in college, I have two choices. The first one is the drafting technology, which is my course right now, and medical field. Simula tayo sa medical field. Recently ko lang nagustuhan ng medical field because I watched many movies or series about then the drafting technology. I chose drafting technology because ito yung malapit sa pagiging architect or architecture course. Being an architect is my dream, biggest dream. Kaya ito yung pinili kong course. Ito yung pinili kong path. Before ko piliin tong course na to, inisip ko, ano nga ba yung mas comfortable na course ako? Mas competent ako. Alam ko na mas mataas yung percent na magsasucceed ako dito sa course na to. So, nag-come up ako sa course na drafting technology. I want to draw. I want to build a house, a home. So, mas pleasurable. Mas pinili ko yung course na mas interesado akong pag-aralan. At ibigay yung self ko sa course na to. There are two types of utilitarianism. First is teleological theory. It is good or desirable as an end to be achieved. Ang example ng teleological theory is like kapag exam, multiple choice A, B, C, D. You have to choose the perfect answer. Dapat morally right ka kapag pinili mo yung answer na yun. Doon mo makikita yung outcome mo. Theological theory is also called consequentialism, the root word consequence. Every decision that you made will have consequence. It's either bad or good. Swerte ka na lang kapag good yung consequence. Second is deontological theory. It is a choice that is morally right regardless of an end consequence. Ang example naman ng deontological theory is nasa market ka and you don't have more time para mamili ng mas maganda na klase. Mara, pinipili mo ay vegetable and fruits. Wala ka ng oras mamili kasi rush hour ka na bumili, so paunahan na lang yon. Hindi mo na iisipin yung consequence, magiging outcome ng pagpili mo. Basta pipili ka na lang regardless of the end consequence. In preliminary statement, utility or greatest happiest principle holds that actions are right in proportion to produce happiness, while wrong tend to produce reverse of happiness. In restatement, according to the greatest happiest principle, it is an ultimate end which things are desirable considering our own good and the other people. Utilitarian method. Identify course of action of parties that are affected. Identify contribution of each course of action to the person's happiness. And choose course of action that is most likely maximize overall happiness.
Utilitarianism. Ang utilitarianismo ay ang konsepto nito ng kasayahan at sakit. Ayon sa filosofiya ng utilitarianismo, ang mabuti ay anumang bagay na nagpapasidhi ng kasayahan at nagpapabawas sa sakit. Ito ang filosofiya ng resulta. Kung ang resulta ng isang aksyon ay nagpapasidhi ng kasayahan at nagpapabawas ng sakit, ang aksyon ay tinuturing na mabuti. Ang theological theory ay isang teorya ng moralidad na kung saan ito ay nagmula sa tungkulin o dapat gawin mula sa kung ano ang tama at kanais-nais para sa nais na makamit. The two way of utilitarianism. Ang utilitarians at utilitarians ay kapakinabangan ng bawat isa sa paggamit ng aksyon para sa ikabubuti ng tao. Nagkakaiba lang sila sa aspeto sa kung anong paraan nila magagamit ito. Utilitarians. Paniniwalaan sa bawat pagpili ng ating gustong gawin dapat ay may kaakibat na paggawa ito galing sa kalooban natin. Ang utilitarianism din ay based sa kilos ng isang tao na kung saan tama ang moralidad at naipapakita ng posibleng resulta ng isang sitwasyon. Ang halimbawa nito ay nasa isa kayong labanan at may nakita kang bomba na malapit sa iyo. Ang unang pumasok sa iyo ay ang sakripisyo ang buhay mo para sa lahat. Rule utilitarianism. Ito ay isang utilitarianism na nagsasabing tama ang aksyong ginagawa ng isang tao kung ito ay sumusunod sa isang patakaran. Ang pagiging tama o pagkakamali din ng isang particular na aksyon ay isang pagpapaandar ng kawastuhan ng patakaran kung saan ito. Sasabi din ang taong sumusunod sa patakaran kahit hindi wasto ay kahit na ay isang alalahanin din para sa karamihan, lalo na't immortal ito. Problems of utilitarianism. Number 1. Measuring happiness is difficult. Hindi kayang sukatin ni naman ang kaligayahang meron ang isang tao. Ang sukat ba para maging masaya ang isang tao ay manalo ng $1 million? Yung di ka naman ang naghihirap niyan kaysa nagkaroon ka ng sariling pera dahil sa iyong paghihirap. Pero di natin masasabi kung paano ba ang espiritu nila sa buhay para maging batayan ng salitang kaligayahan para sa kanila. Number 2. Utilitarian ethics is concerned about the consequences of our action regardless of the action itself. Pagiging padalos-dalos natin sa isang bagay, lalo na sa aksyon na ating nagagawa ay may kaakibat na consequences. Ito rin ay makukuha natin kung tayo nawalan ng kontrol sa bawat gagawin. Number 3. Desired ethical consequences that actually result from our action do not always happen immediately. Pag hindi agad naganap ang consequences ng ating naging action, ganong katagal pa ang iintayin ang magandang consequences bago masabing ito ay isang ethical. Number 4. Happiness shouldn't be the only consequence or goal that matters in some ethical dilemmas. Bagamat ang kahinaan ng isang tao ay ang labis na kaligayahan, ang aksyon na nagawa naman ay mali at di nararapat. Sinasabi rin dito na ang utilitarianism ay makapagbigay ng mga dahilan para sa mga gumawa ng kamalian. And last, number 5. When utilitarian decision benefit the majority at the expense of minority, the minority's rights may not be taken into account. Lahat ng bagay sa mundo ay dapat pantay-pantay ang pagkakakilanlan. Laging pakinggan ang parehong panig na pabuti o hindi man ito wasto. Dahil ang lahat ay maaaring may dahilan kung bakit ito ginagawa.
Globalization and ethical challenges and millennial responses. Ang globalisasyon ay binabago ang mundo pagdating sa pag-usap. Isang resulta sa kultura, pampolitika at matipid na nakikipag-usap sa ngayon ay tumatakbo sa kung ano-anong mahalagang ibinabahagi kahit na nahati sa artificial na pampolitika na tinatawag na bansa. Ang division ng sining na ito sa kabila ng pag-igting ng mga ugnayan sa transaksyon na isinasagawa ng globalisasyon. ang mga tao at pamayanan sa buong mundo ay naging economic o may kaugnayan sa political at pagkakaiba sa pagitan ng pandaigdigan at lokal na naging malabo. Ang mga pangyayari at aksyon sa isang lokal kasama nito ang pampolitika upang makabuo ng mga transaksyon at transgenerational na nakahinatnan.
Good day po. I'm Houston Patrick Faye from DET 220. Sabi po dito, ang salitang globalisasyon po ay nananatiling mahalaga sa kasalukuyang pakikipagdebate sa politika at sa pang-akademikong paraan. Ang globalisasyon po ay isang hindi pangkaraniwang panlaban ng kababalaghan. Ito po ay tungkol sa kung saan mayroong mga kabuluhang hindi pagkasundo at pagkikibak. Tinutukoy po dito na tama ang mga teoryang panlipunan noon ng konseptong globalisasyon kaysa sa karaniwang inaalok ng mga politiko at pundits. Ang mga teoryang globalisasyon ay hindi po sumasang-ayon tungkol sa tamang pagpunan ng mga bagay na parte ng buhay ng tao. Pero sumasang-ayon din sila. Pero ngunit sumang-ayon din sila. Dahil ito daw po ay magiging susi para sa mga kababalaghan na nagaganap dito sa ating mundo. Ang mundo po ay nagiging isang pagdaigdigan ngayon at lalong nagiging makabuluhan. At sinabi po dito na sumulat po si Andreas Krieg na ang globalisasyon po ay isang sari-saring problema na tumutukoy sa ating kalikasan. Para sa iba, ito ay nangangahulugan po na pagbabalik at pagkahulog sa Manchester capitalism na sinulat po ni Krieg. Ang globalisasyon po ay tumutukoy lamang sa mga problema na ating kinakaharap at ito rin po ay isang daan upang magamot natin ang lahat ng mga problema na nilikha natin para sa ating sarili. At sinabi rin po niya na ang mga kumpanya ay sumang-ayon na pumiliin ang modelo ng ethical na kanilang responsibilidad na ito ay sangham lang para sa kanila at sa iba pang mga tao.